Okay, thank you so much. Now, next up, we have Boylan, who is engineering at Evervault. He leads a team building an encryption product. We have an API and SDKs. I've personally used it. It's a complex product, but they have a really highly engaged way of supporting developers and doing developer relations. And it was a great experience being a user. So without further ado, Eoin, I will hand over to you.
Perfect.
Way.
Thanks, Richard. I'm just going to run the same scenario again. If you give me a thumbs up, you can see my screen. That'd be great. Perfect. Okay, I jumped a slide ahead. So I'm just going to talk about how Evervault has built its developer support system, its process, and how we've actually scaled it from the ground up. So just can't seem to change the slide. So I'm the intro to me. I'm the head of engineering at Evervault. You can find me on Twitter. And I build teams and products here which are focused at developers. Just a bit of context on Evervault itself, because I think it's a small company. Everyone's heard of Redis, who's a developer. Not many people have probably heard of Evervault. We're a small company that got started 4 years ago. Right now, we've about 30 people, of which about 50% is in product engineering, and then the rest are in the other business functions. And what we do, like Richard says, is that we take pretty much any form of data and we turn it into something that looks like that. And if that sounds confusing, perfect, because that's the start of this problem and why we had to go to such great lengths to provide a very unique way of providing developer support. So what causes confusion? So like Richard said, we provide a complex product. It does encryption. When you start encrypting things, everyone gets confused. There's a lot of maths involved. There's a lot of keys flying around. And everyone is a bit hesitant because of the security implications of using a product that deals with encryption. So we launched 2 products, and along with those products, we'd also launched a new website and fresh docs to go with it. But then we ran into a bit of a problem when we were talking to our friends who we'd sent early versions of the website to along with the content. They didn't understand it. They didn't understand the use cases, where Evervault would fit inside their stack, and how they would actually integrate the product into their systems. So these are some of the kind of problems that we dealt with early on, where people confused us with a compliance product to help them do SOC 2, or they were having small problems understanding different features of the products, or they thought we were something entirely different altogether. But we kind of came to the conclusion that when the developers were integrating the product itself, we weren't sitting close enough to them. And we thought, okay, the common way to deal with this, let's iterate the website, let's iterate our documentation. But the problem with iterating websites and documentation is that it takes time. If you've ever, met with your designer and you go, we need to tear this up and do it all again, they're going to look at you like you've 7 heads. And it's going to take 2 months to do it. The same goes for documentation. If your documentation has videos, guides, they all need to be rewritten, they all need to be redone. It can take weeks. So that iteration cycle is too slow if you're a small company, you've just launched a product to market. So we're thinking about how we could get closer to the developer while they're integrating our product. So in developer tools in general, there's a pretty famous process called the Stripe install, which came out of YC. And this is a photo of Patrick Collison installing Stripe on an early user's computer, where he's just sitting next to him, downloading the Stripe SDK and actually integrating it themselves. So in this scenario, you can imagine an engineer can highlight exactly what the barriers are to integrating Stripe, what problems they're having. And then on the other side, you get a ton of product feedback, what SDKs they're using, what framework they're using, what languages they're using, what their developer flow is like, how they actually write code can be important to how they use an SDK. So that can feed into your product cycle. But when we looked at this, we were like, okay, how can we replicate a Stripe install? And we thought, okay, let's go out and let's talk to developers. Let's go to meet them where they are. Go to, if you're in Dublin, there's a famous place, not famous, but there's a kind of lots of co-working spaces. So like, let's go out to all the co-work spaces, the WeWorks, Dogpatch Labs is a big one in Dublin. But something happened, COVID, which meant we all had to stay in our homes and nobody could go out and, meet with developers. So we had to get a bit more creative. How could we replicate this scenario remotely from inside our homes? So we looked at what everyone basically does right now. So the kind of traditional models of providing support, which is email, help desk, and your live chat. We found a bunch of problems with these. Email support, incredibly hard to coordinate. If you have multiple people trying to provide support for lots of people inside email, you end up with tools like Front, which is a multi-billion-dollar company that's solved this problem. If you're using help desk software, it's usually built for an entire support team. They're quite expensive. So it wasn't really a fit from when we were only 10 engineers. Live chat kind of comes to the conclusion over time that live chat kind of functions almost like a fancy email product. You can kind of get a glimpse of this into the workings of this because Intercom's, which is probably the best example of live chat's premier product, is called Inbox. It works very much the same way. It's just kind of a slicker interface into what's effectively an email inbox. Another big problem with all those three forms of support is that they introduce churn. So these are two examples I've had recently where I've been integrating products using a service I use already, and I've run into a problem. So what I'll do is I'll go to their support channels, I'll file a ticket. So in one case it's through Intercom, one case is through a help desk software. In both these scenarios, I didn't actually interact with the support agent past the initial message. In one scenario, I'd actually fixed the problem myself. And in another scenario, I churned out of the product. So in this sense, the speed of the SLA of your support can actually affect your churn. Because if your first touch with your product by a developer and they immediately run into a problem, if you're not there to immediately help them, they'll just go use something else, or they'll use a competitor, or they'll find a solution themselves, or they'll build it themselves. So that's something that we wanted to absolutely avoid. So this is how we did it. We looked at what we were using internally, and then in COVID, how we were all communicating, and that was over Slack. And we were like, okay, we're all talking as engineers to each other over Slack. Why can't we talk to any other engineers over Slack? So Slack had launched a shared platform called Slack Connect. And then we thought, okay, we'll take all of our distribution models. So Evervault follows a top-down and bottom-up model for distribution, and we'll feed them all into Slack. And this was a way for us to get as close to the developer as possible. So we kind of came up with the remote Stripe install, and I'm using Richard as an example here. So Richard, like he said, he'd integrated the product 3 months ago, and he ran into a problem. He was using our functions product. Something went wrong with the deployment of one of his functions, and he asked us a question. We'd already set up a shared Slack channel with Richard when he started to integrate Evervault. He posted in a message. You can see that it began at 2:32, and then 5 minutes later, an engineer from Evervault had fixed the problem, given him the solutions to the problem, and then Richard was able to continue on with his integration. But this is one example of a number of questions that Richard had through his whole process, where every time in a very short period of time, an engineer from Evervault was immediately responding or fixing issues that arose. So does this scale? Nope. There is a very famous essay by a very famous person in tech called Paul Graham, which is do things that don't scale. And people get confused with this quote. I think it's one of the most overused quotes. What I think it effectively means when you're a small company is that do the things that would be incredibly expensive for a large company to do and use them as a competitive advantage. So for us, that was, can we take a productivity hit on amazing developer support, something that a large company with thousands of developers and thousands of customers wouldn't be able to do? And so that's what we did. Now, one thing that it does do is that it does open this door where you have engineers and engineers communicating together. And while they're doing that, they're not working on your product, which for a startup is pretty bloody important. So you can see here, you kind of map this as a function. The amount of customers that you have actively integrating is the amount of messages you're going to get. But once they hit the integration point, it immediately drops off. So you can kind of work out, well, we've roughly been able to work out now in our product planning cycles, how much work we're going to have to put into support because of the amount of customers that are actively integrating the product. And you can do some other things too. So we've basically automated this entire system now from the point when a customer interacts with Evervault first, sends out a shared Slack invite to them. And then we have our customer sales team who work in a rotation, almost like support agents. And then whenever they see messages that come in from our customers, they react to them with emojis. And then there's some very nice fancy bots on Slack that allow us to coordinate those messages from the developers into specific channels. So when they react with this eyes emoji, which if you noticed earlier, you would have seen on Richard's message, that gets sent directly to an engineering support channel that contains all of our engineers. If it's not related to engineering, it goes into a private internal channel, and that's where Evervault itself can deal with any other issues that might be to do with, billing or sales questions or compliance questions. So you might be thinking that, okay, you have all your engineers inside one channel, and now you're firing in tons and tons of support into this one channel. That's going to, distract everybody. So one solution that we've come up with to deal with this is that we've built the engineering support function into the on-call engineers' responsibilities. So engineers at Evervault will go on an on-call rota once every 12 to 14 weeks. And in that week, you change job. You leave your product team, and you're now the on-call engineer, which has a defined role and a defined set of responsibilities. And one of them is answering all the engineering support questions. So likely, if you ask Evervault a question over a number of weeks, you'll get different people answering that question for you. What that engineer is actually doing, though, is if they can answer the question themselves, they'll answer immediately, or else they'll go find the person who's responsible for the particular product that the person is asking a question about. They'll get the answer and give it back to the engineer. So some not so benefits that we saw that we never really thought about were when you create these shared Slack channels, there's lots of other people from that customer's company inside that Slack channel. So you might have people from finance, ops, marketing, sales themselves. What that does is that allows us to actually, bring a deal faster through the sales process. So because we can ping people in their legal team, their finance team, their ops team, being like, have you guys got around to looking at the MSA? Have you, figured out some compliance issue with your internal compliance or risk manager? Which has been pretty amazing, to be frank, because it's stopped this giant async lag where you have tons and tons of email threads, and it's just takes so long to get through that process. Another thing is that developers have big egos. I think I'm a developer, and I sometimes do get a bit frustrated when I'm talking to a support person who's non-technical, and I'm just like, please just give me the access code to the engineering team behind you so that I can directly talk to them to fix this problem or solve this issue that I'm having. So when you connect two developers together, they absolutely love it. One other thing is that our SLAs for support tickets now are incredibly quick. So we can acknowledge that something's going wrong in about 2 minutes, but providing an actual solution, remediation, or bringing some action item to that ticket can be done in 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes. That's our kind of averages what they're running with at the moment, and that's across hundreds of customers. So the last kind of important benefit of this is that it's driving Evervault's product feedback cycle. So we don't really benefit from something like an NPS score. We're too small a company. If we send them out, we're not going to get back enough data for us to get anything meaningful from it. This process puts us directly beside these users. So we'll just get messages from time to time of people just asking for features out of nowhere. When they're integrating stuff, they'll just fire things in. And one thing that we've noticed that's a difference between Slack and Discord is that when developers are in a public forum, they become a little bit, we call it kind of stack shy. They won't share exactly how their stack works, what framework what they're actually using internally and how things are configured. either because they don't want to admit how it's configured, or they're just not comfortable doing it in a public setting. But when you have private Slack channels, they'll give you far more feedback on how their architecture actually works, which is very important for Evervault because we integrate so deeply into a developer's stack. But there are some downsides. So very rarely you can run into a situation where two companies don't actually have Slack or paid Slack accounts, which I think probably maybe 5% of our total outreach, this probably happens, which is not a big deal. In that case, we'll usually move towards Discord, or we'll try do the email threading, and we've automated that now so that Discord and email both flow into Slack as well. Channel explosion. Evervault's lucky we hired a bunch of people from Slack, and Slack runs Slack, very different to how people run Slack outside of Slack. That's a lot of times I've said Slack, but basically what this means is that they're extremely organized with how they organize their channels, how they name them, how they group them. So we've actually been able to scale this quite well. Probably the biggest problem is that when you approach people or try to get developers into a Slack channel, they automatically think that they're being upselled into some sort of enterprise product. I think that's because there are enterprise products out there that provide this as their premium support tier, but Evervault does it for individual engineers in two-person companies. So that can be a little bit of a challenge, but it's not so bad. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Eoin. That's fabulous stuff. And yeah, having been on the receiving end of a private Slack channel, I'd say is highly, highly effective.